So I've always thought the story of Transfiguration read to us this morning is an odd tale at best. And it's a particularly odd tale to have as a central place in the worship and life of the church. It is always the story read on the Sunday before Ash Wednesday, a story told in all three synoptic gospels. It's even referred to in the second letter to Peter. A story that for some reason that still remains unclear to me in many ways has become liturgically important enough for the church to read every year at this time. I mean, why this story among so many from the Gospels? What is so important about its content, its message, its meaning? And I'll be honest, every year when I preach on the story, I struggle mightily. And the contours of the story are familiar enough. Jesus takes along with him Peter and James and John to go to the top of the mountain where they are alone, we're told. And in an instant, seemingly out of nowhere, Jesus is transfigured before them. His clothes becoming dazzling white, and we're told in the text, whiter than anyone could bleach them in the whole world. No one in the whole world could bleach them this dazzling white. In my mind, I have cue commercial for Clorox Transfiguration Bleach. Get your clothes whiter than white. And then, in a non sequitur, a kind of amazing kind of moment again, all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah show up chatting with Jesus. You know, it's not unexpected, these two of the greatest heroes of the Hebrew Scriptures, Moses representing the law and Elijah the prophets. And Peter sees them, and Peter's always been the most unabashed and excitable of Jesus' disciples. He throws out, hey, why don't we just make and build 3 shelters here? And we can just stay here on the mountaintop. All of us just hanging out in the glory of it all. And as if that wasn't enough pyrotechnics, there is a voice that comes out of a cloud that all of a sudden appears that says some familiar words. This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. The same essential words which were spoken at his baptism in the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, words of loving grace and affirmation. And then, just as suddenly as it happened, it's over. They no longer see anyone except Jesus, Moses, Elijah, the cloud. They're gone. The snap of fingers. And it kind of makes me wonder, I've kind of in the back of my head, I know this is probably not copacetic, but it kind of made me wonder if they had kind of forwarded some mushrooms on the way up the mountain and eaten them. And the story ends with the odd detail, a strange detail, in which Jesus orders them not to tell anyone about this until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Now, I know looking back when we hear that, we know and realize Jesus is referring to himself, but I can imagine that Peter, James, and John, their confusion and consternation as they pondered these words of Jesus. Hey, what have I seen and I can't say a word about it? Son of Man, who is that? Raised from the dead, what the heck are you talking about? One of the characteristics, if you ever read the Gospel of Mark compared to the other Gospels, Mark was the first Gospel written. It's one of the characteristics of the Gospel of Mark that the disciples could be best described as clueless. Unlike some of the later Gospels, when they got better advertising, the disciples in the later Gospels seem to be more in the know, wiser, discerning what Jesus is saying, nodding their head. In Mark, they wander around and say things like, what did he say? I don't get it. What could he possibly mean by that? What's he doing now? And I'll be truthful and confess, as I read this story this week and this morning, I find myself saying very similar things. What did he say? I don't get it. What could he possibly mean by that? What's he doing now? Now, through the centuries, scholars and preachers have characterized this story as a metaphor for a very human and very meaningful experience, what we call, and we even call them mountaintop experiences, those moments when we recognize God or feel connected to God, or moments in our tradition in which we recognize Jesus for who truly is. It's an affirmation of his divinity, of his sonship, of his special place in the universe among the pantheon of faith heroes. And we have been encouraged, and rightly so, to celebrate those moments. Moments when we truly see Jesus for who he is, and our lives are transfigured by the presence of God. And we're a lot like Peter. I think we'd like to build some shelters, some dwellings on those mountaintops to stay in that place where everything is good and we can see clearly and fully the glory of God. And those moments, many of us can cite in our lives, seem fleeting, and we yearn for that affirmation and grace, those times when we can feel God's presence and love. We yearn, let's be honest, in our faith, in religious life, for those mountaintop experiences. We'd like to see a burning bush which showed up on a mountaintop. We'd like to converse with God, much like Moses did with God, up on the mountaintop. From the mountaintop, Moses brought down the 10 Commandments. From the mountaintop where Moses saw the promised land. Those mountaintops feed our souls, inspire us to be faithful. They are important and meaningful. And it strikes me as I read this text, as I thought about mountaintop experiences, that one of the characteristics for me as we've wandered through this wilderness this past year, amidst our isolation and social distancing, and it has been just about a year, is the very lack of anything I might call a mountaintop experience. The truth be told, it just feels like a daily grind. The same old things each day and every day. Nothing really that much different. I've found myself losing track of the days. I ask my wife, what day is it? What time is it? The same. And those things that feed my soul just don't seem available right now, those little mountaintops. Now, they don't have to be any huge thing. For me, a mountaintop is dinner with friends. Mountaintop is going to a football game at the Kansas City Chiefs. You talk about a religious experience. And in many ways, every Sunday for me, as we gathered in worship, as I saw my brothers and sisters in faith, as I listened to the band and heard the music and heard our voices join, every Sunday in some ways is that mountaintop experience where I can kind of see Jesus transfigured, my religious life fed. God knows I miss those mountaintop experiences. And I believe we will get back to the mountaintop maybe sooner than we expect. The vaccines are coming. We'll have our time together again in restaurants and football games and church. But I, like Peter, want to dwell on that mountain. And I think part of the message of Transfiguration Sunday, and part of the reason I think Jesus encouraged his disciples not to say anything was he wanted to remind them that discipleship, our religious life, is not simply about those mountaintop experiences. It's almost as if Jesus is a little embarrassed. Wants us to understand that faith is not simply about living on the mountaintop, making our dwellings there where Jesus is transfigured. Faith and transformative discipleship is what comes before and after the mountaintop. And the reason I think that is that you really can't understand the story of the Transfiguration in the 9th chapter until you read the chapter before. And what's interesting about the chapter before, it's chapter 8, tells the story of Jesus doing ministry. He's feeding the 5,000, he's arguing with Pharisees and the religious authorities of his time. He's healing the blind men. He's doing this amazing ministry and work. And in the midst of this, and the disciples are following him around going, what's he doing? What's he saying? I don't get it. And then he says something for the first time in the Gospel of Mark that totally shocks them. He tells them, I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. And the disciples freak out. In fact, Peter, who had just a few verses earlier had claimed that Jesus was the Messiah, said, Jesus, you can't do that. That can't happen. That isn't what we're in for, you dying upon a cross. And Jesus says to him, get behind me, Satan. And then he says the words, if anyone wants to follow me every day, they must take up their cross and follow me. It's almost as if Jesus is reminding us that discipleship and faithfulness is lived in the daily and not necessarily in those mountaintop experiences. Those are amazing and meaningful, but real discipleship that transforms us is lived as we're walking through the wilderness. And it may not feel like that. It may feel overwhelming and we may be struggling, but each and every day is when we take up the cross and follow Jesus. And in that kind of discipleship, we learn the lessons from the wilderness. That God is there with us, not simply on the mountain, but in every moment of every day. To God be the honor and glory forever. Amen.